Jó napot, jó estét, kívánjuk. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the very, very last panel of a very long series. And after 2 very thrilling days, I think we are all good reasons to be very happy. And so we are going to finish in beauty with the presentation of Ed West's book and the discussion that is going to follow from it. And so, apart from Ed West that I'm going to introduce now, we also have here on the stage our master novelist here of MCC, our in-house novelist and a very prestigious colleague, Tibor Fischer. So, welcome, Tibor. And welcome, Ed, especially. So,
thank you.
Ed, you already spent a bit of time with us today, yesterday as well. Now is a bit the moment to speak about something else than journalism. We're going to speak more about integration, multiculturalism, and also the consequences of migration. You wrote a book a couple of years ago that is called Diversity Illusion, and that has just been translated into Hungarian, if I'm not mistaken. And so we're going to speak about it. It was some time ago, so maybe we will also in the discussion, confront also what you wrote 5, 6, 7 years ago to what is happening now. And again, I invite everyone also to have a frank discussion, eye-to-eye discussion. It's a cancel culture-free place here. So whether you agree or you disagree, please, speak up. We'll be happy to take all your questions at the end of the discussion as well. Ed West, you spend most of your time now in Unheard, a very prestigious online journal, and basically you spend the rest of your life writing books, a lot of articles in a lot of different journals, Daily Telegraph, Catholic Herald, Evening Standards, The Times, and so on and so forth. You also are an author, you write books, this one for example, and also one that you published very, very recently, and that is called Small Man on the Wrong Side of History, which sounds a bit pessimistic.
Yes, it was. Anyway, first to say thank you, for the introduction, and thank you to the MCC for publishing and for hosting, and it's great to be in Hungary, this country which is talked about a lot in the English-speaking media. So that book, my most recent book, was about conservatism more generally, and about pessimism, my pessimism, and it came out the week of the pandemic hit us, so I was kind of proved correct. But yes, Diversity Illusion, which was written, it came out 8 years ago in England, so yes, a lot has changed. What we've been talking about these last couple of days at the conference was really about the way the media has changed, and that sort of media change, which started in America, really hit off from about 2012, 2013. So even since then, this decade, there's been a shift in, I'd say, what's acceptable opinion in polite circles. So, I mean, if I was honest, I probably wouldn't write this book now because I would be even more disliked than I already am. So, my book, you can see it's got Britain on the front cover. I mean, it's really about England, not Britain, because this sort of diversity experiment has not really happened in other parts of the UK. And the thing about the English is if you go there and you meet them there, unless they're drunk, which is often, they're very polite people. They hate causing a fuss. If they go to a restaurant and they serve terrible food, they won't say anything. They'll just grumble inside resentfully, and they just don't want to cause discord. The famous people don't really say anymore. Mustn't grumble was kind of So that was I guess that was a mustn't grumble, but it actually meant I'm actually grumbling, but I don't want to say anything. So that's why the diversity debate happened in England a particular way, and I think it was when I was growing up, as I reached maturity, if you can say that, I felt it was very affected by this kind of English taboo about saying sort of awkward stuff that might make people feel uncomfortable, and I think partly it was very like quite a good trait in English in that they didn't want to make people feel unwelcome. They didn't want to say things that would silence a room. But as time went on, in the 2000s, we began to get told these repeated messages about how, at one point, diversity is our strength. There was actually posters for a while around London saying that. That was after a terrorist attack. Things like, Britain is a nation of immigrants, diversity makes us stronger. And all these things, the more you looked into them, the more they're either just completely untrue. For example, the nation of immigrants thing, which is a kind of modern invention, or they were based on very, very sort of tenuous arguments. And these arguments were they were just very untested. I mean, like Taleb's great argument about things are anti-fragile. If something's tested, some things get stronger, some things are weaker. These arguments about diversity, they are almost untested because they don't, in sort of intellectual circles, they don't get challenged in a really rigorous way. They just sort of become platitudes. So in Britain, it's fine on a sort of tabloid level to attack immigration, and tabloids can be quite unpleasant about that, to be honest. But the kind of deeper intellectual arguments are just not really made. And once they stop getting made, people sort of almost forget the argument. They can't be made later. They sort of disappear. And I think I get the impression these arguments are sort of only really being had now in Central Europe, which is further down the line to us. So, I mean, so people ask me, why would you write a book which kind of would make you quite unpopular? It might seem a bit rude, a bit unpleasant, but there was a sort of part of me who just thought, this is untrue, and this is based on kind of taboos. So the kind of sort of, the old The Emperor's New Clothes, the boy who can't help saying he's naked. And part of me just thought, I just can't help writing something saying, I just don't think this is true. None of these arguments stand up. My fundamental belief was that what they were arguing for was in the utopian tradition, which is part of has been part of European history, especially the last 200 years, and it's always ended badly. So when people say diversity, well, they don't really mean diversity in its truest sense. I mean, if you look at the English language, diversity used to be another word for inequality. People would talk about diversity of talents amongst people. So it was used once as a justification for inequality in the world, because there are inequalities between people. But now the catchphrase became diversity and equality. So that sort of, again, that made me think, well, these are two completely contradictory things. How can the slogan of the, government departments be two completely contradictory things? So what people mean by diversity, and this is what happens in the States, and this is what happens in Britain, and this is what's going to happen to every country that sort of tries it, is that the people who like diversity also like the idea of equality. So these are two nice things. And as a result of that, they will spend increasing amounts of effort and time and energy and law to achieve these unachievable things. And so the arguments, we often hear the argument, look at the great cities of history in the past. You look at Constantinople, Baghdad, Moorish Spain, the Habsburg Empire. These were cities that were very multicultural, and it's true. They were. None of them were, until the very end at least, democracies. And when they became democracies, things tended to fall apart. And they also sort of multicultural countries where different ethnic groups had almost sort of carved out different niches. Some living in the countryside. Some tend to be intellectuals in the city, some tend to work on farms, and there was never, the idea that they'd all be equal was never possible, and attempts to do so always brought conflict. So again, there was, I can see how they square those ideas together, and in the British context, Britain has historically not had huge amounts of migration until after the Second World War. We had there were French Huguenots, there were Russian Jews who were fleeing pogroms, there were Irish migrants, arguable whether they were sort of immigrants in the truest sense, but we had very, very, very little in a way. So we were sort of starting in a kind of slightly naive idea, like this the rest of the world, the former empire, they would all want to come to Britain, and they would all want to be British, basically, and just be nice sort of, middle-of-the-road Anglicans who like tea and behave like British. When that's a sort of a kind of strange arrogance that everyone wants to be like us. Most people migrate because they want to support their families, or they want to have a better life, or they want to escape getting murdered. They don't do it for the sake of diversity as it's promoted. They don't do it because they particularly want to be British, and many of them won't want to. They won't want their children to be British. Many will, but there is an inherent conflict in that, and it's a kind of arrogance to pretend to think that the rest of the world will want to be like us. So yeah, I mean, it's a taboo subject because when I was growing up, and you probably have a similar experience. Like we were associated, there's people who opposed immigration tend to be like skinheads.
Well, I mean, I think the difference is that, say, going back 30 years, if you so much as mentioned the word immigration, you were pretty much labelled automatically as a Nazi. There really was sort of zero debate about the subject. And as you mentioned, Ed, what suddenly changed everything were the bombings in London. Then suddenly people thought, well, maybe it's a good idea if people who come to live here really speak very good English and integrate and try and learn British values, although it's always a very debatable thing what exactly British values are. So that was the turning point where they introduced, the course for people who wanted to become British citizens, so they had to learn about British history and so on. All this stuff really, I suppose, is a reflection that politicians in general aren't interested in solving problems. I think it's a trait of most politicians everywhere, that politicians have to solve crises because they didn't solve the problems in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, long-termism is not one of the things. I actually, I mean, my children's school, I saw the British values statement they had, and it included the fight against transphobia. I remember thinking, really?
Which is a problem because in many Muslim families,
right? So that is also becoming a problem because, I mean, there was the conflict in a number of schools between Muslim parents who don't want the Stonewall stuff taught to their kids, and I mean, that is the problem with the British values thing, is that these are values which would be completely unrecognisable to my grandparents at their age. The values, even the values of Muslim communities are probably closer than things. So what they mean by British values, they tend to mean progressive values.
Well, I mean, the other thing was that, I mean, there was never any coding. I mean, setting things up formally is also, in a way, a very un-British thing.
Right. Yeah.
We don't have, a carefully, constructed constitution and so on. Britain has a long tradition of sort of laissez-faire and letting things happen.
Muddling through.
Muddling, but that's a very British expression, a very popular one, muddling through. I mean, all this stuff is very difficult to debate because it's complicated. Because of course, lots of people who come to Britain from whichever country fit in very well. Many of them are probably more English than I am in some ways, although I was born in Stockport. And as you mentioned in your book, Ed, Daniel Defoe, the great writer, the author of Robinson Crusoe, wrote a poem called The True-Born Englishman, a sort of satire, where he pointed out that England, London, had always been a sort of a place of immigration, that people had always come to London to make their fortune and to settle down. So this is, in a sense, a debate that goes back a long way.
But precisely, what is the difference between this poem and the situation that you describe now, and the situation of your country?
I think it's. I mean, I think wasn't Defoe in the pay of the Dutch king? That's why he was a journalist. He was just paying.
Daniel Defoe would have done anything for a fiver.
True journalist.
Yes, a real. I mean, he is in many senses the founding father, also of British journalism. I mean, I have a great admiration for him precisely because he could write that, you know, black is white one day and then the complete opposite the next, if he were paid.
I mean, I think like a lot of things, it comes down to, you know, sheer numbers, really. I mean, this is the kind of complexity of an issue like this, where you might think, well, you know, I know people from lots of different backgrounds. Everyone rubs along and everyone gets on fine. And a lot of these things, people can differentiate between an individual and a group. And once a group comes and it's a certain size, then it completely changes the context. So, you know, you can use London, you can see one street, one area where migration really works and it's great. And then the next area, it might be a bit of a failure and a bit of a disaster. I mean, a lot of it depends on how wealthy, which I'll come to in a bit, the areas are. It does depend on the wealth. The term, you know, the migration thing, this is often brought up, so, well, you know, the Saxons came along and then before them the Celts came along and then after them the Normans came along. So, but like in every single case, it was a disaster for the people there. I mean, they got either eliminated or they were just sort of driven out or they sort of lost their status. You know, migration has two stories. It has the people coming and it has the people already there. And we're all the products of the mix of both groups. So looking back, it obviously seems fine because we're all descended from them. So, you know, it's no tragedy for us as individuals because we're the product of the past, but then we all are in a certain sense. I mean, in my own background, I'm a mix of English and Irish, and I'm a product of English involvement in Ireland historically, which I'm glad that happened because I exist. But I mean, if I had met my Irish ancestor 500 years ago, you know, they would have not been happy about it, and you know, maybe they're not being happy about their descendants speaking, you know, English. So I mean, I think it's just the terms of the scale. So you know, when you know, in the 1990s, there had been a sort of equilibrium in Britain. We'd had migration from the 48 to the 60s, and then there'd been kind of restrictions, and it was kind of agreed restrictions were a good idea, and it was quite stable. And you know, there was some quite nasty racism for newcomers, but things had certainly improved. And I think one of the things resulting of that was just people were becoming more liberal, but there's also a certain amount of stability. But then there was a sort of, after Blair came along, there was a second wave of migration, much, much larger in size. And it came in so many different forms. You know, you'd have migration from other wealthy countries, you'd have migration from Central Europe, which strangely made the subject much more palatable to talk about because it was, the people were white, you know, to put it frankly. There was also migration, in particular from Pakistan and Bangladesh, which was family migration, which is the most difficult because it basically stops integration. It means the sort of community is reinforced with its home culture and increases numbers very, very rapidly.
It creates diasporas, and diasporas are actually hurdles to integration.
And the problem is once, yeah, there are hurdles to integration, and diasporas form diasporas. So once you have a community settled in the town, then that creates processes for more members of the community. And in those cases, it wasn't just the same ethnic group. It was, I mean, families. It was a lot of very close cousin marriage. And so there you had the strange kind of situation. We did the most clannish societies on Earth migrating to probably the sort of least clannish societies, Northwest Europe. And there's been a lot, you know, quite a lot of trouble, difficulties, migrations. But
I mean that's one of the funny things, actually, I think about immigration is that it's very, very hard to find, even on the far right, to find people who are completely against the idea of immigration. All the problems really arise from how much integration, who controls it, and who comes in. That's really
right. Yeah. I mean, one of the strange things I get, you know, I think is taught about. I think this is kind of Americanism, you know. So the idea is I don't want to have to go to Americans all the time, but I mean, American academics sort of the ideas do seep down to Britain very easily. You know, we're taught like you can be, you know, you're racist or you're anti-racist, and it's just like most people are a spectrum of everything. There's no you know, like very few people have perfect pitch, very few people are tone deaf. Most people are somewhere in the middle. Very few people are completely, you know, just boneheadedly racist about migration, and almost no one is completely racist. I think most people have their prejudice and fears and have mixed feelings about things generally.
But what is the turning point precisely? Is it a matter of critical mass, like too many from the same place? Is it a matter also of cultural affinities? Is it the same thing to migrate as an Irish or to migrate as a Muslim Pakistani, for example? I mean, where do you see? Because I also have a look at the title of your book. Even if you're a pessimistic, you say what we got wrong about immigration and how to set it right.
You know, the publishers made me put that. I just said there's no solution. Sorry, I just said yesterday. I'm not very good at solutions.
You have to give us at least some clues about it.
I just want to be on the boat saying, you know, the boat's sinking. I've got nothing to offer, but.
I mean, one of the things that I don't think is borne in mind enough is that if you are a democracy, you need to be sort of careful about who you let in, because the whole point of a democracy is that you can behave in any way you want, that you can dress in any way you want and live in, you know, within reason in any style you choose. And I mean, one of the problems we may be facing in Britain and Europe is that a lot of the people who come in aren't from countries with a democratic tradition. Democracy is not something genetic. You know, democracy is something that is the result of education and that people believe in it.
And you have to have things, you know, losers' consent, which is the big worry, I think, in the future, is you have to. I mean, Roger Scruton, you know, is named after. He was a big thing of his. I mean, his views in this would probably make him pretty unacceptable. He was luckily the sort of right age where it's still about okay to say it. But you know, his big thing was losers' consent. You know, you're a society of strangers. You don't look at your family for protection. You look at the state and you look at the results of elections as something you're part of. So if you lose, you know, your government are out for 5 years, whatever, but you accept that. That I think that is harder than people think in a kind of multicultural society, because people think, well, it's not my government. They don't represent me.
And precisely, let me just ask you, to both of you, because Tibor, you're also a British citizen, if I'm not mistaken. So
still got my passport.
You still got your passport, and you were born there.
The black ones. Right.
To what extent do you think there is a risk of a civil conflict in your country because of, you know, migration?
Well, it's what Ed was saying. I don't think that is very likely, because Britain is an incredibly tolerant country, basically. My parents left Hungary in '56 and went to England, and they were treated, you know, as all the sort of Hungarian people who turned up there with extreme kindness and fine. You can always argue it was perhaps a little easier for Hungarians to integrate because they're white and usually of a Christian sort of background. But no, I think England, that is, I think, one of the great British values, that there is a great deal of tolerance, and that wonderful expression you used there, to rub along. That's a very English expression, because you rub along and actually there isn't friction, you get on. So I don't think migration necessarily will cause problems, because of course, I mean, a lot of the people who do turn up are coming precisely because they want, to some extent, to fit in and to work. If there is going to be trouble, it's going to be more to do, I think, with economic issues rather than anything else. But, you know, who knows?
I mean, yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think you can see further, anyone can see further past 20 years, and I don't think there's, wouldn't be civil conflict. I mean, I know the French like talking about that, but I don't know if they're just, you know, that's kind of performative Frenchness, and they like talking about, you know, coups and stuff. But I think in Britain, my points about migration is that if you have a lot of diversity, it ends up obsessing you, and it distracts from more important things. And I think for a lot of people, I think, as Christopher Caldwell just said, you know, it just makes life a bit crummier for you. It just means you want to move from your house and move schools because you just feel a bit alienated. Doesn't mean your country's going to fall into civil war, but it's just one of those things where that's the kind of problem where you could probably avoid And if your country is in a position to avoid it, or at least take it very slowly, then I would do that.
Do you feel like large-scale parallel societies, for example? You already have them in some cities, but can you imagine this phenomenon to be actually exponential?
I mean, London is like very, big city. Some parts of London feel kind of quite dystopian. There are. I mean, and technology makes that obviously easier because of, they call them dish cities in parts where. Parts of Europe, but you can kind of you can not integrate if you don't want to, and I think in big cities have a kind of like certain amount of leeway where they can handle that. They have sort of Chinatowns is the classic example where that's kind of fine. You have your own quarters, and traditionally big multicultural cities had sort of different quarters. I mean, my main view is that you mentioned the D words. The problem with this is that when it comes to democracy, if you have a sort of this kind of social change, and it's really been quite unpopular, and it's done without people's real consent, they sort of rub along and get on with it. But I think it does kind of undermine the political system a little bit. Not in a way that people want to sort of have violent revolutions, but I think it kind of invites a bit of cynicism. And diversity, lots of societies have been diverse, but there's never really been a successful diverse democracy that's lasted that long. I mean, democracies did originate in, liberal democracy originated in very homogenous societies around the North Sea for a reason. So what we will have the choice where we will have to sort of lose one of those things. We will have to have a bit less democracy, I think. To sort of accommodate people.
Tibor, you may want to elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, the other thing I'd like to sort of add as a writer, I mean, what slightly irks me about these discussions is how badly language is used. I mean, generally, for instance, if you go to any sort of British Anglo-Saxon website now, whether it's a government site or a business site or a university, you will see somewhere a message about diversity and inclusion and equality. And of course, it's almost Orwellian because it's not really anything to do with that. The diversity is certainly, for instance, in the universities. I mean, there's very little intellectual diversity. I mean, the universities traditionally have always been a little bit to the left. But I think now that's become very much more pronounced. I mean, it's perfectly okay to be either a former communist or a Marxist now at a British university. There are lots of academics who are quite open about their ideological position. And I personally have no problem with having a Marxist or two in a university. Why not? But you'd have to look extremely hard, and you wouldn't be able to find, say, a neo-Nazi or, a sort of, revised fascism supporter somewhere in a British university.
I mean, even someone who's quite fruity on the right would be banned.
Even conservative probably be quite tough.
I mean, there have been talks about having sort of quotas for conservatives. That's kind of come up as an idea to sort of to give them protection, like a protected characteristic. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I think with the reading of those things, they're everywhere. I mean, that is partly because it's the law. And one of the problems I sort of mentioned in the book is that a whole legal framework has to arise to manage diversity. I mean, the really successful example is Singapore. I mean, Singapore has all sorts of laws against criticizing other religious groups because it was founded by almost kind of cynical founders who realized, this could like fall apart really quickly, and we have to make sure that the people's voice is not listened to so much, because it was a multicultural society, and in all multicultural societies, you end up with this kind of framework, this industry, and that's why the sort of diversity and inclusion is everywhere, and I think most people just kind of invite sort of deadened cynicism, doesn't it? They just see it.
Well, I mean, I would just sort of add, I don't have much experience in Singapore, but I was out there for a while teaching creative writing. And I did notice, I mean, this is extremely subjective, but I did get the feeling from some of my students that they were very careful about what they were writing in a way that, say, students in America weren't.
Gentlemen, let me just do a bit of housekeeping. I just remind you here that you can ask questions through Slido, which is a bit of an Orwellian way of asking questions, so you can also raise your hands, to be honest. But if you want to ask them through Slido, the code is 910733. Would you like me to say it in Hungarian? No. Kilenc, 10, 7, 3. And so we are also waiting for your questions, again, through Slido, or maybe since it's the last panel of a long series, we can also, raise our hands. You mentioned the legal framework, Ed, as well. And to what extent human rights has a responsibility in this situation that you describe? The laws, the human rights as such, but also the culture around human rights. One of the things you said, also yourself, Tibor, is that it's difficult to pick and choose persons according to your values. Why? Because it would be seen as discrimination, one of the sacrosanct, principles of today. So the culture of non-discrimination, the culture of human rights, to what extent it has a responsibility in this situation, this disastrous situation that both of you are describing? Especially you, Ed, you will be the most pessimistic one in the panel today.
I'm always the most pessimistic. I mean, discrimination is another example where the language has changed, either through sort of subtle enforcement by groups, or kind of deliberate. Discrimination used to mean that's this discriminating person was someone who can make good choices. Now it has an overwhelmingly pejorative kind of moral term. I mean, I think. At the moment, so the Conservative government in Britain is kind of slightly hamstrung because a lot of these laws have been put into place, and once your opponents do that, you are very limited in what you can do. They can spend a lot of energy trying to overturn this law, and it would also face the weight of the sort of deep state, whatever would be against it. I mean, my point is that once you start these anti-discrimination laws, which seem very, noble and kind in theory, it's virtually impossible to get rid of them. I mean, no one has. I mean, a lot of all these problems is once you go down certain routes, you can't go back. So you need to be. To me, that makes me think, well, that should make people very cautious about going down these routes in the first place. You can't untangle these things, and then you have a situation where if someone says, "Well, you know what? I think that level of migration might have been like might have been a mistake." You say, "Well, what are you going to do? You can't no sort of ethical Western country is going to deport people. You can't undo diversity. You can't, as far as I know, I don't think any country has sailed back on these equality discrimination laws, and at the moment in Britain there's no real energy to do so. There's no real urge, so they're just going to sort of get stronger and stronger and stronger. And so that is my sort of message of doom to readers in Central Europe, that if you do follow the British example, there's no way back, really.
Well, to some extent, the legislation, fine, if you go to a government website, it's not surprising to see a notice about all that stuff, but it has reached sort of ludicrous proportions. You go to the website of, say, a jewellery company, and there will still be, a sort of great big paragraph about diversity and inclusion and modern slavery and so on. And it is what is often referred to as sort of virtue signalling. So maybe it'll eventually peter out. Who knows? But again, it's as a writer, the thing about equality that annoys me the most is that they don't really mean equality as such. The problem is really about poverty, because, for instance, if your book sells lots of copies and you have 3 million quid,
that'd be great,
which would be great, and my book sells, say, less, but I still have 1 million quid. The problem really isn't the inequality, because we're both okay. The problem is poverty, not equality.
That is the problem. This is another thing that's coming. So equity replaces equality in parlance these days, because equity really means equality of outcomes. And there was actually equality of outcomes in racial groups, which is kind of, you know, that sounds lovely. It's impossible. It's never happened in any society. And there was, I think, when I think 200 people were sacked. There's a story in the States, 200 workers in a industrial plant in a sort of white area lost their jobs. And one of the papers did say, well, this actually will increase equity in the area. 200 guys thrown have lost their jobs. Amazing. You know, so if equity is your goal, equality outcomes in groups, the obvious losers are going to be poorer members of the majority. And, you know, poor whites in the States are the sort of victims of affirmative action. They're overwhelmingly losers. So wealthy people aren't, you know, affected. Their children still get in. And so you have a situation where people know that they're, you know, like they are sort of tasked to be the sacrificial victims here. I mean, they can see it happening. And in that case, you think, well, why would someone like that go along with this? Why would you want that? When, you know, your failure would be celebrated because it would actually help increase equity in this kind of like weird utopian project we have.
I feel sorry for the interpreters. I apologise for playing with language.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. But I mean, language is very important because it's, you know, it is about. You'll find every word changes meaning slightly, and the tone changes every 3 or 4 years, and then all of a sudden, someone decides this word is not acceptable, and we all have to go along. It is a very strange situation where a word can completely mean something different.
Tibor, that's the price to pay to have real native speakers on stage and not only globish speakers like the rest of us. Let's speak a bit about the rest of Europe. I mean, do you think that the problem you described also exists, which is and we know the answer is yes, obviously, but in other Western European countries, and if yes, and it's yes, in which ones actually? Where do you see like the most problematic cases in the rest of Western Europe? To both of you.
I mean, everyone's unhappy in their own different ways. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it depends which issue you're talking about. I mean,
the lack of integration, migration.
The migration issue, which again, you know, annoys me because certainly journalists in Britain nearly always talk about migration and not illegal migration anymore, because if you want to come to Britain, actually there are perfectly legal ways of doing it and getting a job and so on. It's illegal migration. I mean, I'm not a prophet, but I think there is going to come a point which I come back to my earlier statement that politicians aren't very keen on solving problems, but they end up having to deal with crises. And I think eventually the shutters will have to come down, because it's nothing to do with the sort of lack of compassion or humanity, but the numbers of people who are coming in are such that eventually I think the governments of Western Europe, who very much like to, I think, virtue signal, or what I often call, you know, playing Jesus Christ with other people's money, they're going to have to do something. But you know, it's probably going to have to get worse before they bite the bullet.
It's yeah. I mean, it's an unpleasant job, and no one wants to do it, and no one wants to look. I mean, there's a word in British politics which is applies to a lot of things, which is, you know, vibe. It doesn't really matter what's actually happening. It's like the vibe of something. What does it look like? Does it feel nice? And everyone wants, you know, a nice vibe around their politics. And we've got to a situation where we're so squeamish about, no one wants to see, there's pictures of poor migrants. And, you know, as human beings, of course, like, I empathize with them. Everyone who wouldn't empathize with someone who wants to improve their lives. But we're so squeamish about it in Northwest Europe that we get to the point where, okay, we're just going to get the Greeks and Turks to do it, and then we'll sort of, you know, we'll publicly criticize Hungary and Poland, but actually want them to defend Europe because we just don't want to do it ourselves. But it's such a, you know, a subject that makes people feel so uncomfortable in the media. Like the New York Times headline today was about, you know, this border crisis will embolden Poland's nationalist hardliners, and it said Poland and Belarus should both be reasonable. It's like you wouldn't believe that a country in Europe is actually basically being invaded. It's a hostile power is sending people over its border in a sort of aggressive way. So it's perfectly reasonable for a country to defend its borders, and yet the focus is on
and to have some say who comes in.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe in democracy, it comes down to it. People people aren't stupid. If they are overridden on this subject, and if it's obvious that their views don't matter, and if it's obvious that their politicians care more about humanity in the abstract, then that will translate into cynicism about the system. So I think most people agree. Poland has the right to defend its border. Hungary has the right to defend its border, and I think most people in Western Europe would agree with that, even though they might not want to say it publicly.
And precisely speaking a bit about solutions, let me ask you a controversial question. But do you think that one of the solutions was Brexit? Did you take back control on your migration flows?
No.
No, I don't. I think the irony of Brexit is it actually might make Britain more progressive, more liberal. I think the EU is becoming much more of a kind of civilization state and understands, the borders are going up because the EU is there for Europe, while Britain has become almost much more kind of, I don't know.
Well, no, I speak as the son of refugees, so obviously I'm very sympathetic to the idea of people finding refuge. But the way the law works now is that you can smuggle yourself into Britain, paying someone 15 grand, 20 grand. Or get a boat across the channel now. I think today there was a record number of people.
1,000, is it?
1,000. I think again, it won't be next week or next year probably, but eventually the whole idea of this asylum, that you turn up in a country and you automatically have the right to asylum, will have to change.
Yeah,
I think it's one thing for a government to decide, as they did in the case of Yugoslavia, to bring people over to Britain because it was obvious there was a problem and that Britain could do something about it. But as I say, I have no idea whether this will happen. But I think at some point it will reach that level where asylum just stops. That the British government says, well, from time to time we will grant people asylum, but you can't just turn up and expect to get it.
Let me maybe switch now to the link between migration and terrorism, and let me share an anecdote with you. When I was a young advisor in the European Parliament 15 years ago, the first thing I did was something on terrorist radicalization. And I remember by then already, there was a British think tank that criticized a practice that in several British villages, which had a pig in their coat of arms, they unilaterally removed it not to offend Muslim fellows. The Muslims didn't ask for it. They didn't ask for anything, but unilaterally they decided to do that. And sometimes, giving this impression that too much multiculturalism eroded the capacity of migrants to integrate. That was basically the message. And it was really on a report on terrorist radicalization. That the fact that you didn't give a British identity to migrants and you didn't have anything to offer to them in terms of identity, that was part of a very complex problem, but it was part of it. Do you think that makes sense or not?
No, that's completely true. In almost all these cases, it's oversensitive. British fish, yeah, it's kind of, and it's all in Western, and in no cases, no Muslim complains, no Muslim is going to complain. It's like stuff. There's some occasionally there's a picture of a pig or something, and they say it might offend Muslims, and the local Muslims say, "Why would you care?" It's
like this business that you're not allowed to mention Christmas anymore.
The vast majority of Muslims say, "Of course, we wouldn't be offended by that. This is a Christian country. We don't mind." The interesting thing is, the thing I mentioned in the book is, it's kind of unfortunate that integration has happened at a time when we've had a kind of big kind of social change, which makes identity, our national identity, much harder to define. I use the example in the late 19th century, the Jewish Free School in East London was set up by the established Jewish community in Britain was Sephardic. They'd been around for 200 years, and they were very long integrated. And when the Russian Jews came along, they were a little bit worried. They thought, these guys are so alien, they're going to cause resentment amongst locals. So they set up this school. The whole idea was, we'll take your Russian boy and we'll turn him into an English gentleman in 7 years. And it was an incredibly successful school. But they had a sort of template of what that meant to be an English gentleman. I mean, this was obviously the peak of imperial confidence. It's the 1880s. And I think by the time, 100 years later, so there's a famous case, and it actually involved Roger Scruton, who ran the magazine, the Salisbury Review. There was a school in Bradford where a teacher said, we're allowing, so the school is majority Pakistani, second generation, and they had full multiculturalism, and they were allowing pupils to actually just go off to Pakistan for weeks on end and not even ask them about them, and they were told to be sensitive about all racial issues. They were told that integration, sort of anything that's integration is kind of forcing, it's kind of basically racist. And there's a famous case in Britain where this headmaster says, we are not helping these kids by not trying to get them to integrate. We're not, we're doing them a disservice and not helping them. And it caused a huge outcry. This guy ended up getting he had to leave his job as a headmaster. And this was seen as kind of like the low points of multiculturalism, because if your country is so filled with cringe as the British are, and so embarrassed about themselves, which is a kind of irony which is fine amongst British people at university where it's all sort of part of the culture, but if you're trying to integrate people from a different continent, from a different culture, that kind of level of irony and self-deprecating kind of humour is not great. It's not going to integrate them. I mean, later that, this headmaster in question, Ray Honeyford, was kind of exonerated, and everyone said afterwards, well, he was right, basically. But I think that kind of level of the cringe is still. I mean, I like the British Reserve. I like the irony, the lack of tub thumping. It's kind of quite a nice trait, but it does make it hard when you've got huge numbers of people to integrate.
Yeah, so at the end, maybe it's also a matter of numbers, no? At the end, imagine a migration model whereby you have only small amounts of persons from a lot of different countries. That might make it easier to integrate, no? If basically you don't find too many fellows of the same culture, the same country, the same religion, no? I don't know, a real melting pot, if there's such a thing. I mean,
I think probably the most successful areas in London are like that. I mean, but they tend to be, so the issue is not talked about is money, because, it's been said the wealthy have their own border control. It's called house prices. In London, house prices are insane. So if you live in a nice area, and if your neighbour to live next door to you has to be worth, whatever, £1 million or £2 million, then by definition, he or she's going to be filtered to be sort of highly educated, and he's going to be a member of the same sort of, professional class, and it's not going to be a sort of part of a sort of huge ethnic ghetto. And so if you look at the nicer areas of London, you'll get 20 different languages spoken in the classroom. But all the parents are professionals. They probably all actually have the exact same opinions as well, but they come from a variety of different cultures. I mean, and then in the less successful ones, you'll see. The extreme example in London was Tower Hamlets was basically sort of like a fiefdom, which was entirely run by people from one part of Bangladesh. And the council, I mean, I can't even say too much because of our libel laws, but it ended up getting into huge amounts of trouble, and it was, and that was an extreme example of where basically, an area had become just a sort of ethnic enclave, while, 2 miles down the road, there'd be like...
But that is quite, I mean, that's the one sort of egregious example, really. I mean, one of the interesting things I think about London is actually that it is very, very mixed. I mean, even the richer areas still will have a sort of block of council flats not so far away.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there aren't that you can't. You're right. There is a certain amount of cheek by jowl, isn't the phrase? But
I mean, certainly compared to America. I mean, for instance, I live in Brixton, which used to be a very Jamaican area, and was famous for its riots, which were largely interpreted as sort of racial riots. But if you were white and you lived there, I don't think you ever had problems because of your race, because you live there, and so people knew each other. There is a certain amount of success in that regard, because you don't have the American system where you get an area which is completely set aside, where there's one group, but with the exception of Tower Hamlets.
Yeah,
maybe Slough as well, I don't know. But
gentlemen, let me just ask to the audience whether they have questions. We still have 10 minutes ahead of us.
Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. Ed,
hello.
I'm sure you're familiar with the book that Zadie Smith wrote,
Yes.
White Teeth.
Yeah.
And in it, she discusses the challenge of the second generation. For them, they are the other, and it creates challenges for them feeling a part of the new society to which their parents have brought them. Do we have any information about what happens with the third generation of immigrants, or do you have any feelings about how the third generation, or even fourth, are assimilating? Thank you.
That's a very good, interesting question. I think we're still too early in a kind of experiment to know. I mean, the second generation experience is an interesting one, because it's one of dislocation often and alienation. So I think I mentioned it, like a lot of novelists come from second generation immigrant backgrounds, because it kind of gives them a sort of both sides, maybe a sense of stepping in between cultures. But then you had the other example where the sort of terrorist problem in Britain was second generation. It was almost exclusively often parents who are actually more integrated. The younger generation who grew up in England were less integrated because they just felt more alienated, because they weren't sure what they were. I mean, my general feeling is, again, it would depend on the community in question. I would say, like on my experience, I think amongst like sort of so if you say upper middle class Asian families, they would probably have more European names in the third generation, probably slightly abandoning religion. I mean, we do have data on religion, which tends to at least fall in most groups within the third generation.
If I may jump in France, for example, in French-speaking countries, so in Belgium and in France, countries that I know well, there is clearly a phenomenon of disintegration as from the third generation. So the third generation is less integrated than the second, and especially than the first. So the first is best integrated. You come, head down, you do as you like in Rome, do like Romans do. The second generation is fairly well integrated, but the third starts asking a lot of questions. For example, and that can also be fanned, by controversies like on colonialism. So today in France, you have hundreds of thousands of youngsters whose grandparents were born in France that hate their country.
I mean, since it's Zadie's novel we're talking about, which is about London, a lot of people have got into trouble in the last few years. It's John Cleese, I think, Morrissey, and some others who've sort of said, well, London isn't an English city anymore. And actually, they're right, because first of all, there's the census figures that, even the white British are now a minority in London. What I've noticed is that a lot of the younger people don't think of themselves so much as English, but either British or indeed as Londoners. I think there's very much a London identity for kids now, and a lot of them think of themselves as that.
Which is a regression.
Is it? I mean, it's different. I mean, London is a sort of free port now, like New York, where everyone's there.
That kind of civic, the sort of civic in the old, literal sense, nationalism is kind of...
Well, it's sort of postal code,
yeah.
maybe, national, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably true.
Any other questions from the audience, maybe? No? Paul, please.
Thank you for the talk, Ed. It was very interesting. I wondered if you were to do a second edition to your book, you would obviously need to take into account the post-Brexit situation. I wonder, did the Brexit experience make the fantasy of multiculturalism appear for what it is, a kind of dystopian fantasy? Or perhaps, a bit like Tibor is saying, will the English bourgeoisie still prefer to manage crises rather than actually solve problems?
I mean, I had mixed feelings about Brexit. I think one of the paradoxes of it was immigration became, after about 2004, it became a much more daily topic. About 2005, 2004, you could see it became much more talked about in the media, when before it was a bit more taboo. One of the reasons was it was AIDS migration made it a bit more acceptable to talk about, because it was mostly white Europeans, and people could say, well, I have all these other reasons for disliking migration. But the result of that was UKIP was a sort of product of opposition to, I don't know if you're Hungarian, you might not know, the UK Independence Party. So they were a Brexit party, but they were also basically a sort of, anti-mass immigration party, and that was a big driver of their support. And their support actually rose before AA migration actually started. It was around 1999. So the drive, so UKIP was kind of a product of hostility to sort of migration generally, not just the EU, but in people's minds, those two came together. But what is the interesting thing is that, the polls showed that both Remain and Leave voters much prefer European migration from within the EU than outside migration. So the irony is, Poles are the biggest migrant population in that decade, but generally speaking, there wasn't really much hostility. So I mean, quite a few Poles did support Brexit as well. It seems paradoxical, but and so people weren't really objecting to immigration from other European countries, but that kind of got how it got portrayed. And as a result of Brexit, that migration from the rest of Europe will be much harder, but the government will seek now to get migration from outside of Europe, which is not what Leave voters wanted. I think partly that's to do with, taboos about discussing. We prefer to talk about migration in an abstract idea, as if migration from every single country is the same, when it actually, when it's, can vastly different between populations, especially if, people are selected. I don't think, no, I think people will probably become more pro-diversity since. I think what things change is we've got much more of the sort of like post-George Floyd's, racial justice and racial equity has become much more of an issue. And, the British intelligentsia just copy whatever the Americans do, even when it's completely, inappropriate. I mean, my kids get taught, my children age 8 had been taught, my eldest was taught 3 figures by the time she was 8, and it was Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the Rosa Parks. That's what in a school in North London, it just seems really bizarre. So the moment, kind of copying the American model of talking about race endlessly is basically going to be the next 30 years for Britain. Something to look forward to.
Thank you, Ed. We still have 41 seconds ahead of us.
I can depress you more.
So maybe it is the right time to wrap up, unless, Tibor, you want maybe to have some concluding remarks?
Well, I'd like to wish everyone a very good weekend.
Good weekend. And we would also like to thank them for being with us until the very, very last second. Thank you very much, Tibor. Many thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
It's indeed pessimistic. It's indeed pessimistic, but again, let's try to solve the problems before they turn into crisis. Thank you very much. Köszönöm szépen.